So we're going to start with this panel. Let me just introduce quickly the wonderful moderator that we have for this one, which is Karen Levy. Karen is a postdoctoral research fellow here at the Information Law Institute at NYU, and a fellow at Data and Society. And she'll be introducing the panel and moderating.
Okay, hi everyone. Welcome back from the break. For this panel, we'll be looking at some different policy approaches to open data presented by two teams of researchers. So first we'll hear from Solon, Barocas, and Arvind Narayanan. Arvind is, where are you, Arvind? Back there in the plaid shirt. Arvind's going to hang out back there for now, but I think we'll come up for questions if there are questions about that project for him. They're both from Princeton University CITP, the Center for IT Policy. And after that, we'll hear from Micah Altman from MIT and Alexandra Wood from the Berkman Center at Harvard. Unfortunately, their colleague David O'Brien was not able to be here today, so they'll be covering that project. So we'll just go ahead and get started.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to use the lectern. If that's okay. Okay, great. Hi, everyone. Thanks very much for having me here. I'm pleased to be presenting a slightly extended, newer version of the material that I presented at the Berkeley conference, which was great. And so, as you can see, I've changed the title accordingly to not just government open data, but open data in general. So this is a project that I've been working on with Arvind, and it's specifically looking at the problem that inference poses for privacy. And so I'll just start off with a few examples to give you a sense of the problem we're interested in. Some people might be familiar with the fellow here on the far, I guess it's the left, who's Ken Kukier, the author of the major big data treatise. And this is an interview that he had a couple years ago, which involved Jeff. Yeah. Okay. Jeff Hemmerback, who is the person who started Facebook's data science team, has gone on to become a kind of important figure in data science generally. In any event, during this interview, it came out that Facebook had actually built a system to simply infer the gender of people who didn't disclose their gender. So this kind of casual disclosure didn't seem to perturb anyone, and it just the conversation carried on. But it's an example of the fact that you can actually infer things that users have specifically not disclosed or chosen not to disclose. And of course, people I'm sure are familiar with this very now famous story from the New York Times Magazine, which describes how Target developed what they called a pregnancy prediction score, which allowed Target to relatively reliably predict whether in the next 3 months a particular customer was likely to give birth to a child. And it did this by simply looking at what they were purchasing at the store. So just looking at the purchase habits was enough information to make an inference about the fact that the customer was likely an impending parent. And now there's been considerable work within computer science itself and academic research that has begun to show the power of inference. And so this is a now, I think, important study in the field which showed that, this is done by a group of researchers at Cambridge, that showed that it would be possible to make all sorts of inferences about personal characteristics and personality traits by simply looking at what users on Facebook happen to like, meaning the thumbs up button on Facebook. And for those who are interested in this research, they actually have a website where you can log in with your Facebook credentials, and actually it will tell you what inferences will make about you based on what you have liked in the past. So I encourage people to check this out. To give you a sense, I'm sure you won't be able to see the slide, but to give you a sense of what they were actually able to do, there are a variety of things that they were trying to infer, some more effectively than others, but things like gender were being inferred at an accuracy rate of 93%, simply based on what you like. Whether or not someone happens to be black or white was possible to infer at 95% accuracy. Whether someone happens to smoke, drink alcohol, take drugs, if their parents got divorced at the age of 21 or earlier. A variety of categorical inferences. They were also able to do some interesting stuff that were basically trying to these are sort of continuous variables. So how satisfied is the person with life? Are they extrovert? What is their intelligence, right? So these are kind of not just personal characteristics, but sort of personality traits and features of your personality. And to give you an example, as I mentioned, the authors present some of these, to make sense of the work they've done, they have a table in their research that shows what some of those likes are that seem to be most predictive of this particular trait. And in this case, I'm showing you the table from IQ. This is a bit misleading for reasons I can explain some other time if you're interested. But the point here anyway is that it shows things like, well, if you happen to like Mozart, The Godfather, this seems to be highly predictive of high IQ, which is maybe not terribly surprising. However, there are all things that are actually quite upsetting and depressing about the low IQ prediction. So if you happen to like Tyler Perry, or you actually affirmatively say that I love being a mom, that this actually is predictive of low IQ. So this is to give you a sense of the kind of inputs to the inference. But anyway, this is a general problem that we're trying to focus on here, and I think you have a sense of what I'm now concerned with. And really, inference here then is something that's really troubling for privacy because it does three things. It's a way to glean facts that haven't been disclosed, to guess at characteristics that might not be observable directly, and to avoid the need to get that information from someone else. And in many ways, these are the traditional ways that we've actually regulated privacy. We've relied on putting limits on these various mechanisms to ensure people's privacy. And in a way, inference is able to circumvent all of them. And in particular, what interests us is machine learning, which is the process of automating inference, of being able to learn interesting patterns from data that allow us to make inferences automatically. So you might say, why does this have to do with open government data? Well, there are certain things that we need to at least consider. The first is that oftentimes the information and these data sets are the result of compelled disclosure. People have to provide this information. It's not a matter of choice. And that often you have to share information because it's necessary for the provision of some kind of basic public service. And it's an important thing to also notice that machine learning thrives on exactly this because these are going to be extremely comprehensive records of the population. These are not going to be select groups of people who chose to share their information. This is going to be everyone who happens to be interacting with the government, which is pretty much everyone. And the comprehensiveness of the data provides a much more reliable basis for machine learning. So you might think, well, how do we even approach this problem? Isn't it a kind of fool's errand to think that there's a way to manage the risk that there could be, kind of invasive, sensitive, adverse inferences drawn from the data that government makes open. And in particular, it seems to be the point of making the data open, right? You want to facilitate uses that are not things that you can anticipate in advance. If the government could do it on its own or know to do it on its own, maybe it would. And often it will seem that these initiatives to open up government data will be perceived as successful precisely because they're facilitating unexpected, novel, strange things. Right? But let me walk through 4 schemes to give you a sense of why this is still something that we need to consider and how we actually might reason about this problem in some systematic way. So I'm sure many people, as was discussed this morning, are very familiar with the risk of re-identification and the release of data sets. And the risk is one that's illustrated here. So we have an anonymized data set. Let's say in this case it refers to people who have a particular disease. I don't know, Crohn's disease, let's say, right? And the data has been anonymized. Theoretically, it's not possible to re-identify each individual person in that data set. But it's possible, as we know, and as Arvind has demonstrated very successfully in a number of cases, to rely on auxiliary information from outside the data set, which can be matched with an anonymized data set so that you can make a deductive inference that this record must refer to this person because they're the only person that seems to have this same set of characteristics in the non-anonymized data set. Right? So what's key here is that this is a deductive inference which necessarily must be true given these 2 facts. Right? This is in contrast to what we have in machine learning, which actually relies on induction. Instead, the process has this additional step. You basically take a large set of examples, and from that set of examples, you try to extract some kind of useful rule. You try to discover if there are patterns in the data that can then serve as the basis for some rule that you can apply in the future. Right? So in this case, rather than trying to figure out that this record in the anonymized database about Crohn's disease refers to this person, here what we can do is rely on a limited set of cases where we know someone has Crohn's and we know all these other features about them, and then we train a model looking at those features which happen to be predictive of Crohn's. So we're not actually trying to infer whether the person in this anonymized data set is this exact person with Crohn's. Instead, what we're doing here is developing a general way of making an inference about Crohn's by looking at many other features. And so what's interesting here too is that this is in many ways a way to circumvent some of the restrictions that prevent discriminatory treatment. We can actually infer things like race or gender or sexual orientation or disability indirectly. We don't have to actually get that information directly, and then we can subject people to discriminatory treatment. And interestingly, this could also happen even if there is no conscious intention to discriminate. It could simply be that in trying to maximize some business goal, business objective, the machine learning process basically is reconstituting some of these traits and then treating people differently, even though there was no explicit attempt to do so. So what we try to say here is that we kind of need to come to terms with this, that we really can't ask for these affirmative, we can't ask for affirmative evidence that shows that it's not possible to make these inferences in the way that we might with reunification. And our ability to kind of curtail the range of inferences that can be drawn from data is pretty limited. But we shouldn't pretend that we can have all the benefits we want of open data without having to at least consider some of these potential costs. And so what we've done is taken a kind of two-pronged approach here. One is to try to understand when inferences cross an ethical line. And that's some work that I've begun to do on my own somewhat, looking at sort of how do we reason about the norms and appropriateness of inferences. And with that kind of work, the hope would be that we foster some ethical behavior among practitioners. But the other prong in the work that we're doing here is really trying to understand the limits to inference and identify the factors that render inference difficult or unreliable, with the goal of then trying to exploit these limits in various kinds of policies or mitigations. And so what we say here is that there really are radically different policy implications of a world in which inference is pervasive but not very reliable as compared to a world in which inferences are actually highly accurate. And what we want to stress is that although the media is often portraying things like machine learning as being enormously accurate, terrifyingly accurate, the majority of machine learning in practice is actually unsuccessful, right? So this comes from a paper within the field that basically says there's a huge reporting bias among academics because only the successful applications of machine learning get published, when in fact it's much more common that things are unsuccessful. And so based on this understanding, we kind of want to begin to think a little bit more systematically about what those limiting factors are. So we've tried to divide this up into two things. One, on the one hand, is limitations in the data or in the machine learning methods itself, and then limitations which are basically posed by the nonlinearity of the phenomena that we're concerned with, meaning that there's just something fundamentally unpredictable about the thing we want to make an inference about. And distinguishing between these cases is actually crucially important to being able to reason about it with a goal to developing policy. So this is a way of trying to break down some of those things. So there could be a variety of issues with the data that you use to train the model on the first column here. There could be some problems with the learning method. It could be that if we had an infinite amount of computational power or time, we could do certain things, but that we don't exist in that world, so that's what's constraining the ability to make inference. It could be that the state of the science of machine learning is not sufficiently developed to make certain kinds of inference. And finally, as I was saying, it could be the phenomena itself that sort of resists prediction because it's fundamentally chaotic. And so, to what extent can we begin to figure out which limit is at play in any given situation we're concerned with? And so there's some interesting work from computer science itself that seems to present different arguments on this question. This is an interesting paper that basically says that really the advances in machine learning in the past decade have had very little to do with the sophistication of the learning method. It's been much more about the sudden abundance of data. So the argument in this paper basically says, given enough data, we'll be able to learn anything. And it doesn't really need to depend on sophisticated ways of learning from that data. But if anyone has been following some of the work in deep learning, this sort of emergence area of machine learning that has become extremely successful, dominant in the field, this gives a sense that actually it's not just the data. There are going to be advances in the science of machine learning that of course crucially depend on the quality of the data that will determine what can be reliably inferred. And deep learning has now been deployed very successfully for things like object detection, voice recognition, at levels of accuracy that were basically thought impossible. So really showing that this is not just a limit of the data, but a state of the science really matters. And then finally, it could be that the phenomena we care about are actually just fundamentally difficult to model. So we know that inferring gender, in fact, Arvind has done excellent work on this, that inferring gender from narrative text is very difficult. Trying to figure out whether the author of a text is male or female is surprisingly difficult, even though we're actually able to very successfully identify specific authors based on their prior writing styles, right? So I'm able to make a really good re-identification of an anonymous author, but it's actually quite difficult in general to be able to distinguish whether the writer is male or female, right? That said, as I showed you at the start of the presentation, it doesn't seem that that's true of all ways of inferring gender, right? It's possible, as I showed you, to use likes to reliably infer gender. It sounds like Facebook had figured out other ways to try to figure that out too. And so what are some of the potential targets of intervention? How do we actually intervene here to limit the potential adverse inferences? And I'll return to this model to say that there are really two moments here that seem like they could be sites of intervention. One is this first instance of induction. Can we intervene in the process of induction, or can we intervene in the application of the rule that has been induced from these data? So if we wanted to intervene in the inductive step, it seems like what we're trying to do is regulate scientific discovery. We're trying to say, let's not make it possible for people to infer certain interesting things from the data. Let's limit what can be learned from the data. And yet, that happens often. There are inherent limits, and we might want to ask, how much data is necessary? What kind of data is necessary? How many people have to disclose these attributes to provide enough examples that can then be used to generalize some rule? These are some fundamental questions that are kind of technical questions, but because they're difficult to answer technically, it's an interesting place to maybe focus for policy interventions too. And it's also possible to think about perturbing the data along the lines of what we do in more sophisticated anonymization techniques. So things like differential privacy, which are actually designed specifically to enable drawing interesting inferences while preserving the anonymity of the subjects in the data set. That set of techniques has begun to translate into a new area within computer science, which is basically concerned with discrimination-aware data mining, discrimination-aware machine learning. And some of the methods there involve similar techniques with a different goal, not to prevent re-identification, but to prevent inferences about protected class, whether you actually happen to be a woman or a man or what have you. And so that's also another area to consider. And then finally, if we wanted to focus instead on the deductive step, meaning when we have this rule in hand and we want to apply it to any particular case, can we actually intervene at that moment? And one of the questions there is, how easily can we withhold or conceal those features? For instance, how easily can we withhold the likes that make it possible to draw those inferences upon which this inference depends? And interestingly, it might not be possible to withhold those pieces of information, right? It might not actually be possible because many seemingly trivial things could be highly predictive. Or even if we could tell you what you have to withhold, which likes you necessarily have to withhold, actually instructing people to do that can be, I think, very undesirable because you're essentially telling people to not do things which might be socially or economically beneficial, right? And another way of thinking about this is, like, even if you did have this information, how easily accessible is that information to all parties? Can they apply the rule successfully, or if they have information, or do they have to actually go to considerable steps to be able to know that, yes, you have these set of likes, and therefore we can apply the rule to you? Anyway, and I'll just end very quickly, I'm sorry I'm going late, by saying that there's also some emerging research now forthcoming that basically says that even if we could begin to do this kind of work, it's hard to make any general statement about it because it really depends on the way we try to learn from the data. The different machine learning methods we apply to extract some rule will determine how successfully we can actually conceal those facts to prevent this deductive inference. So this just kind of begins to sketch out some of the difficult problems that inference poses, but also some potential sites of intervention. So thanks very much.
Okay. Thanks, Solon. So now we'll hear from Alexandra and Micah.
Hello, everyone. My name is Alexandra Wood, and I'm a fellow at the Berkman Center, and I'm joined here by Micah Altman from MIT Libraries, and we're here on behalf of our colleagues David O'Brien and Urs Gasser from the Berkman Center, as well as Salil Vadan from the School of Engineering and Applied Sciences at Harvard. And we're very excited to speak with you all today about a research project we've been pursuing over the last year that we're calling a framework for modern privacy analysis. But first, I'll note a standard disclaimer that the views we express are our own and not those of our institutions, our funders, and collaborators. And also to provide a bit of background, we are members of the Privacy Tools for Sharing Research Data project at Harvard. This is a broad, multidisciplinary project involving a collaboration across 5 research centers at Harvard and MIT. It brings together computer scientists, statisticians, data scientists, social scientists, lawyers, and policy analysts to tackle the problem of enabling social scientists to share research data about individuals in a way that protects the privacy of the individual subjects. And we're ultimately trying to bring theoretical advances in privacy to practice through the development of integrated technical and legal tools, frameworks, and policy recommendations. And the project that we speak about today highlights and applies some of the concepts and approaches that we're exploring through the Privacy Tools project, and all of the related publications are available through our website. Our research project is motivated by a phenomenon that is familiar to most of us in the room. Recent efforts by governments to make more data available to the public through a variety of means. These efforts are very exciting because they promote democratic values like transparency, accountability, and civic engagement. And the data that are being released can also support scientific research and innovation in the private sector. But at the same time, there's a recognition that many of the government data sets being released pertain to individuals and therefore carry privacy risks. There's also a growing awareness that traditional approaches to privacy are becoming decreasingly effective at protecting privacy in practice in light of more sophisticated methods for re-identifying or learning about individuals, even in redacted or aggregated data. So in light of this context, what we're seeing is that as governments move to release more data, they've expressed a lot of interest in applying techniques to protect the privacy interests of individuals in the data. However, no clear framework currently exists to guide them in selecting privacy controls that are tailored to the specific use cases they're considering. To explore these topics and begin formulating a solution, we've selected examples of real-world data releases to examine the factors related to privacy and utility through an in-depth use case analysis. We've also aimed to dissect and apply recent advances in data privacy from computer science, statistics, and legal scholarship. For example, we draw from research on quantitatively measuring privacy and utility, assessing the effectiveness of legal and policy governance mechanisms, and balancing research opportunity and the nature of privacy risks. And we ultimately propose a new framework for modern privacy analysis that's informed by these emerging concepts and approaches to privacy that move beyond traditional approaches. So for this research, we base our findings on a literature review, a use case analysis, and a series of expert interviews. Our use case analysis in particular is focused on 4 broad categories of government data releases, including government releases of information in response to Freedom of Information Act and Privacy Act requests. So these are compelled disclosures of information in accordance with federal and state sunshine laws. We also look at the release of personal information as public and vital records at the state and local levels. These include things like birth certificates, business licenses, property records, and court records. We also consider official statistics produced by the Census Bureau and the Bureau of Labor Statistics, And finally, we looked at recent government releases of data through open government initiatives. So these are turning traditional data release mechanisms on their head, moving towards more aggressive releases of information as these data are made available to the public without restriction. And for each use case, we compared the types of information released, the standards used to make release decisions, and the privacy interventions we see in use. And our goal was to better understand the range of practices currently in place as a starting point for our recommendations. And what we found through this analysis of the 4 use cases is that despite the availability of a wide range of different types of privacy interventions that are available, in practice, governments are applying a very narrow subset of those. In fact, most agencies rely on a single approach. Either they redact or withhold information containing pieces of information they consider to be directly or indirectly identifiable. We also found that agencies lack formal guidance for selecting among and implementing privacy interventions in specific cases. So the guidance materials we found describe privacy risks at a very high level and provide a few examples of situations in which privacy risks might appear and give examples of the types of privacy techniques like redaction and aggregation that are available. However, there's very little guidance for designing a comprehensive data release program that implements privacy controls that are tailored to the unique risks of the data that are being released. We also found that similar privacy risks, and in some cases even identical data sets, are treated differently by different government actors. So this suggests that practices are inconsistent and perhaps suboptimal. And we argue that these gaps demonstrate the need for a more systematic approach to privacy analysis. So in response to the gaps that we find in current practice, what we recommend is this new framework, which is modeled on approaches from the information security literature and makes use of a well-established life cycle approach to data management. This enables an actor to conduct a more systematic review of the factors that are related to privacy and utility at each stage of the information life cycle, and select controls that are appropriately tailored to a specific data release case and more likely provide effective privacy protection at different points of intervention. And we focus on 3 main components of this framework. First is a catalog of privacy controls. The second is a taxonomy of uses, threats, and vulnerabilities. And the third is a need to design data releases that align these uses, vulnerabilities, and threats with appropriate privacy controls at each stage. So first, we have a taxonomy that distinguishes between various factors related to privacy and utility, namely uses, threats, harms, and vulnerabilities, where threats are potential adverse circumstances or events that could cause harm to a data subject as a result of that subject's inclusion in the data. And this covers everything from a malicious attack on a system to a lost laptop. Harms or injuries sustained by a data subject as a result of a threat being realized, like reputational harm, loss of employability or insurability, civil or criminal liability. Vulnerabilities are characteristics that increase the likelihood that threats will be realized, including those related to identifiability or the learning potential of the data. And utility is defined broadly as the analytic value of the data, encompassing the intended analyses using the data. And for each of these concepts, we provide some examples and initial guidance on identifying and assessing them in specific data release cases. And we make use of a life cycle approach. And so this can be used to guide a systematic review of each stage of the information life cycle, from collection to transformation, retention, release, and post-access. We also developed this catalog of privacy controls that outlines the different controls that are available at each stage and across different categories from procedural, economic, educational, legal, and technical. I'll I'll hand it over to Micah, who will talk about how this framework can be interpreted and applied.
Oh yeah, the easy part. So, again, you know, the logic of the disclaimers was that anything that you like, really, anything that makes sense in this presentation, we owe to a whole lot more other people. And anything that we dislike, that you dislike, this as our own stupidity in this presentation. But what this paper attempts to do is look at this tremendous range of suggested interventions. And there are interventions, I mean, we've talked about technical interventions, there are interventions on the educational side, on the legal side, on the procedural side, and you can do these at all along the information lifecycle, right? From the time that you collect data, when you retain it, when you release it, and even after release, there are interventions that may improve the privacy. And this is important because we're learning that privacy is not simply binary, it's not a matter of identification, it's a matter of what can be learned. And so the difficult problem is to calibrate what you get out of sharing this data with the sorts of risks that sharing creates. And the risks come both from what might be expected to harm people if that data, if information were learned about them from that data, and how likely they are to be able to learn information from that. And so if you sort of combine the learning on one side, there are a number of things we can do to reduce the chance that someone will learn something about an individual that they might act on to cause them harm or result harm. And that ranges from some of the things that we do now, remove direct or indirect identifiers, which may well be reasonable things to do and sort of reduce some of the risk, but they don't reduce the risk entirely. And in fact, there are lots of other things that we could do, or even formal analyses that we could do to bound the risk of learning. And there are a range of harms that may come from the data. And depending on what we choose to do, what's feasible in terms of reducing information, because reducing information also reduces the utility you can get from it. And even sophisticated ways of reducing information, like differential privacy, reduce the utility, reduce the potential uses. So there's no free lunch. But if you've got something you might learn a lot, and it could cause long-term harm, you should have a richer set of controls. Right? And the controls could be applied at various points. They might include notice and consent at the beginning, and being able to inspect the information while it's retained and while it's used, formal application oversight, or even secure data and vetting of all interaction. And so this provides a very broad framework. And the trick is in aligning uses, threats, and vulnerabilities. And so what we suggest is, for some common cases, a number of combinations of practices to where you should restrict data entirely to vetted users, where a click-through might suffice. But in other work, and in general, we've strongly advocated for tiered access, so that there will be different uses. And in research, it may be difficult to anticipate what all the possible uses. So there should be, an escape valve where there is secure access to vetted users available for research use. And analysis is focused on government data, and the general framework fits, but the question of calibrating the controls to harms and risks is right now very much a case-by-case calibration. Even the measurement of harms, sensitivity of data is not, always well characterized. And there's a very important question of institutional capacity. So what we need to understand is not only what, in an ideal circumstance, a full set of controls would look like that involves the sophisticated interventions that colleagues like Arvind are developing, but how we have stepping stones, how we have sets of interventions or on-ramps so that institutions like municipal governments can find and make use of appropriate controls. Thank you.
Okay, so we'll open the floor for questions. Arvind, I don't know if you want to come up, or maybe you should come up just in case there are questions for you. Maybe as folks come up to the microphone, I'll take a moderator's privilege and go ahead and ask a question of both groups, which is about the temporal dimension to open data. So I'm curious, in either of your projects, whether there seems to be sort of a shift in time as data ages, during which kind of this balance between social utility and, oh, here, I'll scooch over, Arvind, and risk to privacy invasive application or inference, whether that seems to shift over time based on the age of the information, and if so, whether that would imply some sort of policy that takes that into account and either sort of sunsets the data or sunrises the data over time, either implements constraints or alternatively opens it up more as time passes, sort of like we do for like IP in some arenas. I'm curious if that's come up at all.
I guess since I'm sitting right next to you, I'll try my hand at it. So it's hard to make predictions, especially about the future, as many people have commented, and that's true with harm as well. And they're sort of countervailing forces. One is that the activity that a data describes, as you go in time, becomes often less and less relevant. So the potential harm and possibly the availability, at least historically, the availability of contextual information to link has been less and less. But we've seen in the big data era that at least that availability portion has reversed, right? That it used to be that the longer time you went to re-examine a source, the less contextual information you had in an archive, et cetera. And now more and more information about people, more and more contextual information is available as time goes on. So you're not sure what the ancillary information is, but it tends to increase. So one of the things that we talk about, there's no silver bullet for this. One of the things we recommend is looking at controls, not just when you release the data, but how do you help to mitigate risks and after data is released, whether that's through monitoring for external data sources or building into data releases the right of actions by individual to, if their data is misused, or offering people the ability to inspect or to know where their data flows to.
That's a great question, and something that Arvind and I had thought about a little bit. And so within machine learning, there's this notion of drift. And drift is important here because you can learn some kind of thing from the data. So let's potentially focus here on like IQ, right? We know that these likes happen to be reliable predictors of IQ. But it could be that like 20 years from now, because culture has changed, people consume different things, they like different things, that relationship that you would discover from data that's 20 years old really wouldn't be very reliable when applied to people now, right? And so there's an interesting question there, is like, is time a way of like, for policy reasons, potentially reducing the kinds of useful things you infer from the data? And what that really is showing is that in general, data will probably become like generally less useful over time when the thing that you're using it to infer is something quite dynamic, right? And so it's just hard to know how to use that as a tool for policymaking, because it could be very well that we're losing things of great value while also at the same time maybe protecting people from certain kinds of inferences.
Thanks.
Okay.
Is it possible to flip back to one of your slides, Micah
No.
and Alexandra? It is not. Okay. So I'm the slide with the grid. Yeah, that slide seems to kind of presume that the thing that would be causing the harm is a discrete and isolated incident, which you can array on a level of severity, which I think puts it in direct tension with some of the leaps and bounds stuff in Solon and Arvind's paper. And particularly what I'm thinking of is financial profiling for purposes of credit and consumer purchases, where you have inferences made that sort of sort people into tranches based on their profit potential, right? Their credit worthiness or the kinds of things that can be marketed to them, resulting in sort of durable patterns of financial inclusion or marginalization, and there's some overlap with other, indicators of marginalized communities. And I don't see how that grid addresses that problem. In fact, I would think it cannot, and I would think that Solon and Arvind might have some perspective on that as well. But I'd be interested in all of your perspectives on that.
So that grid is an important but illustrative part of the paper, and I think we need to dive into the definition of sensitivity more richly. I'm reminded of ex-archivist in the United States comment that any engineering problem is simple to describe, simple if you describe only the first 80%. So, I mean, as a sensitivity, I think you're right that in this literature, sensitivity has been treated often as a concept that's easy to measure, as something that's related to a discrete and foreseeable set of incidents. What we intend is to reflect the sort of expected cumulative harm in the future of having this data released. But this is not, and I'm not aware that it's done as a tightly defined concept. Ideally, what we do is look at people, from the sociology, from the psychology literature, from the economics literature, look at people's life courses over their entire, how happy are they, how much income, how healthy, all of those things that make up a good life. Look at the intervention of this data and see how that affects their health, their life courses. Do some evaluation. Does a little dip make a difference if it's persistent? So it's not merely a matter of adding it up, but of some other more complex function of how it relates persistently to your life, and then evaluate across multiple people, some of whom are going to be, if you have a particular data release, some will be affected more than others, right? So maybe if it affects people, most people, in a moderate way, but some people severely, you can't simply average it out. That is all very complex right now and case-specific evaluation of sensitivity. We would hope, and we think that that's important to think of both about the range of people's future experiences and the range of people who are affected, right? Not just the average experience or the average person. But there's right now no systematic way of approaching that we're aware of.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just add that the irony here, unfortunately, is that a lot of the sophisticated ways we have of trying to prevent re-identification are in place often to facilitate the inferences that you're describing, right? So it's precisely because we can protect people's identity that we then can draw useful inferences from the data that can allow us to then sort people. So in a way, like re-identification as a tactic, strategies to prevent re-identification are almost in the service of precisely what you're describing. So it's a really tricky, unfortunate problem. And I guess one of the things to explore is that can some of the same techniques that we've developed to protect protect against reunification translate to some of the things that rightly I think worry you, Julie? So, yeah.
Let me perhaps add one anecdote to that that I think illustrates the problem of trying to predict the sensitivity of some data, especially in the future. It's hard enough with vanilla re-identification. It's hard to know what other data set a particular data release could be combined with. But when you start talking about inference, one of my favorite anecdotes that illustrates how hard this is apparently banks wanted to figure out when they're making a small business loan, they wanted to use machine learning to infer, and this is very similar to the financial example that the questioner brought up. What is the probability or what is the likelihood that the applicant of the small business loan would be able to pay it back, right? And they tried a variety of things, but at one point there was a breakthrough in accuracy. And when they nailed down exactly what was going on there, they found that the most predictive set of variables was in fact the consumer behavior of the person or the business taking out the loan. It wasn't so much the variables about how the restaurant or the business is performing, but in their personal life, how good is the restaurant owner at things like going to the dentist? That in particular turned out to be a very predictive variable because apparently there is some hidden connection between people who are proactive in scheduling dentist visits also having more financial prudence in managing their finances. And Solon, I think you remember the book that this came with. It slips my came from. This slips my mind.
Eric Siegel's predictive analytics book, I think.
Thank you. Right. So, how does one put this into a group of categorical variables, right? So this set of data about you is going to lead to this sort of prediction or not that sort of prediction. Until that experiment has been done, until a data scientist has actually tried it and figured out whether it works or not. So it just seems to deeply confound our intuitions, and that is one of the things that we try to point out in our paper. I think it is a worthwhile endeavor to do this. I think it's important. We need to improve our intuitions, but I think it's a much more challenging problem than it sounds at first sight.
Okay, can I just ask speakers first to introduce yourselves? And we have about 10 more minutes, so I think we can still do one by one, but let's just keep both questions and responses kind of snappy. Thanks.
Hi, my name's Jacqueline, and I'm a user experience designer. And what I would like to know is, I understand privacy and all of these things are a major issue, and I see in my work that people differentiate, the government shouldn't know my blah on X form or whatever. And then you also have users interacting with a lot of corporations and entities that are exploiting them. Frequently users are not aware of this, sometimes they are, whether it be Facebook or Target breach or whatever. Like, I'm not trying to identify one thing. I'm wondering if any of the user groups or studies that you guys have conducted around people's, let's say, openness to open data, if that, via the government, if that has any sort of correlation with users' beliefs about, Google or Microsoft or whomever else that they are, whether it be willingly or unwillingly, sharing a lot of their personal information with.
I met someone in the room must have an answer to this question. Has anyone done kind of survey research on people's attitudes towards open data and how it might relate? Yeah, okay.
That's what our focus groups were, at least in the case of Seattle. Ryan? Well, anyway, so our focus groups, we did find, you got to understand the method of focus group research is to bring people together in groups and work with others. So we brought them together and asked them to express their hopes and their fears around open data.
So since we're supposed to be snappy, this is the question of people's understanding of their consent to privacy. Their understanding and consent is a very complex one and involves both understanding what they're doing, the implications, and feeling like they have a choice. I'll just offer one data point. And at the previous FTC meeting on workshop on mobile information privacy, and industry presented a survey, and the slides are up, and where most people felt very comfortable sharing their location with marketers but they were very uncomfortable that the marketers had location history, which is not logically inconsistent, but reflects a gap in an understanding of what they're consenting to. So.
I'm Joris van Hoboken. I'm here at NYU. I'm one of the organizers, actually. So my question is actually both projects, they focus very much on the harm and how to manage that related to privacy. That kind of privacy is very much the access of looking at some of the challenges that open data have. But I think with both of the projects, I wonder, like, how could you situate them in a broader literature about some of the challenges that open data could have? And specifically with the Inferences project, I wonder what type of inferences are not like this. You have this specific subset of inferences drawn from data that is about like sensitive things that people wouldn't have disclosed about themselves. But are there other types of like maybe harmful inferences that could be made, or unpredictable kind of harm that could come from data? And like, is there literature about that? So I'm very curious about that. And with this, actually, this slide is kind of helpful for this question, because if I look at the types of harm that are there, I think you still have kind of privacy there as a proxy, and think of personal data as kind of a proxy addressing the problem and trying to kind of manage it. But in a way, you could also think about like the harms really being of a more structural nature and not really kind of framing them as privacy problems, but in terms of correlations between data and violence and so maybe another way of kind of looking at some of the challenges. That's my question.
That's a great question, Joris, and hopefully Arvind will come in on this as well. But to give you an example, and I think this actually plays off what Julie was saying earlier, which is that it's very possible that some of the inferences that can be drawn can be about, and Arvind will say more maybe, about like the value of your home. Because it's now possible, given the data that's been opened, to make a much, much more accurate assessment of the quality of your home. Or like you say, it could actually tell you about the likelihood of being a victim of violence in a particular neighborhood at a much greater degree of granularity, right? So it says, like, if you live in this particular house, I can now make a pretty good prediction. And those aren't really like privacy harms sort of traditionally construed. Those are sort of about like how open data can have the effect of either exposing like the nature of inequality and the conditions of like inequality in society, and then in some ways subjecting people who are in a less favorable position to maybe even greater harm or stigma. And so, to what degree should we be considering how open data figures into some of these unfortunate dynamics in society already? But of course, the other thing to say about this is that open data can be an amazing tool to combat those exact same dynamics. So we shouldn't, I think, just dismiss it as always problematic.
So I'll just add one point to what Solon said. This is, once again, showing a contrast between how I think our thinking needs to evolve from when we were worried about re-identification to now when we're worried about inference. With re-identification, we were worried about something that's not part of the normal set of things that companies were trying to do with the data, right? We were worried about a malicious actor doing re-identification to do something totally different that the data were not intended for in the first place. With inference, there is a more fundamental tension between the original purposes for which the data are being collected and analyzed and the things that people become uncomfortable about. For example, when there were concerns about the inferences that Facebook was making, their response for one of those PR incidents was, oh, there's no privacy worries here. We're not sharing your data with anybody that the data were not supposed to be shown to, right? So engineers have traditionally had a very sort of narrow way of looking at it in terms of privacy problems, black and white. This is something you can and cannot do. But with inference, it's much harder to draw the line and navigate the tension.
And just briefly, in our paper, You could spend, again, volumes on any of these subjects and harms. We construed harms broadly, not just direct intrusion upon seclusion, privacy harms, but what harms might derive from sharing of the information, the individual, group, or society level. And for us, I think the biggest tension is sort of measuring, is that it's often easy to measure the individual harms. It's harder to measure those larger societal harms and also the societal benefits from open data, right? So that you want to include all of these things, but they're not equally accessible to measurement.
Let's take these last two comments together.
Great. So I'm Ginny from Berkeley Law, and you both mentioned ways of approaching the dangers of, that open data poses, Solon through intervention points, Micah through the framework. What actors, be it like government, industry, researchers, do you see actually implementing these potential solutions, and why?
Thank you for really interesting presentations. I wanted to link the keynote, some of the themes from the keynote, connect to some of the points made in this panel, and then looking ahead to the afternoon. Because this panel has drawn attention to some of the, let's call it, potential dangers of open data that are either tractable and maybe even intractable. But if we take seriously the idea of access for all, what would it take? And I know this is like a little pie in the sky, but what would it take to turn the tables? We can see how the big entities, the government, the big corporation could maybe exploit individuals by doing this, but is there some way that if we do the genuine access for all and the ability for the machine, even the machine learning capabilities to come into the hands of the individuals or the public interest advocates, is there a way to kind of turn the tables to the advantage of, for lack of a better word, the small people?
Well, in response to the first question, we intend for our framework to be broadly applicable and to apply to actors at every stage of the information lifecycle. So that would be the actors that are collecting data, actors that are storing data, making it available to others, as well as the users of the data. And the range of privacy protections and interventions that we identify in the paper are quite broad and can be selected among and applied by each of those different types of actors.
I think the contrast of the two questions is beautiful. That, I mean, it's the classic social science and policy. On the one hand, what if we think about an entirely new system, and what would be the equilibrium? And then the question is, well, how do we move anywhere on this? How do we get people to adopt these things, increment? And so I don't have a real good answer to your question, Helen. It's an attractive vision, but I also, the ability to use information is also related to resources. And so simply making information available to everyone may not make it, may still not make the tables even, and may lead to an unequal equilibrium in how that's used. So I don't have deep intuitions there, but I have worries on both sides. And incrementally, I think finding, although this is designed for wide application, finding communities of practice where there is a vertical set of stakeholders, some consumers and producers who need this information, and giving some tools that allow them to make decisions in the future more cheaply, right? To standardize, have some standardized license agreements, have some tiers of access that fit most of these use cases. I think that's where the leverage is in moving on the policy.
Okay. Any final thoughts from Solon and Arvind?
I mean, I'm going to try to answer both at the same time. So, I think there's very limited amount we can expect of the data releaser. when it comes to like broad questions of inference, not just reunification. But I think there's lots of interesting opportunities to like train a generation of emerging computer scientists and machine learning people to, first of all, be sensitive to the kinds of inferences that they're going to make with these tools, and to consider, what the implications are of doing so. And I think in doing that kind of work and sensitizing computer scientists to those concerns, it also, I think, puts kind of like social justice issues generally, like also on the agenda, right? So suddenly it becomes like interesting and worthwhile to use these techniques to like tackle questions of inequality or uneven distribution of like police violence or whatever it might be. And to me, they're just kind of thematically and conceptually related, that it seems like worthwhile to bring that to the people who will be using the data. And that seems more promising to me than saying like, let's just make sure that people everywhere have like meaningful access. Because I think the way to act on it like successfully will really mean getting people who have been well trained to work in the interest of these communities who don't really have the resources to do it.
No.
Okay, thanks so much, guys. So if you'll join me in thanking everyone, and then immediately following that, we'll have lunch, which I believe is in the back of the room, and we'll reconvene at 1:30.